The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest Europe had ever seen. Snow fell endlessly over the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, turning roads into frozen rivers and trenches into graves of ice. The wind howled through the Ardennes, cutting through the soldiers' uniforms like knives. For the German army, already exhausted, hungry and undersupplied, the cold was as deadly as the enemy itself. But that winter, something happened that no one in the German ranks could believe. When they came face to face with the American forces, they didn't just meet a powerful army. They met soldiers dressed like they had come from another world. In December 1944, as Hitler launched his last desperate offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, tens of thousands of German soldiers marched into the snow, believing they could push the Allies back to the sea. They carried their old rifles, wore their worn-out boots, and wrapped themselves in whatever rags they could find. Their uniforms were thin, designed for spring battles, not for the icy nightmare that had descended upon Europe. At first, they had confidence. The surprise attack was working. The Americans were caught off guard, retreating through the snow-covered woods. German officers shouted orders, tanks rolled forward, and morale rose. But soon, as temperatures dropped below -20 degrees, the real enemy revealed itself: the cold. Frostbite began spreading faster than bullets. Soldiers' fingers turned black, boots froze solid, and many couldn't even hold their weapons. The German winter gear, made of poor wool and weak leather, offered no protection. Every step in the snow felt like walking on knives. And then came the shock. During one of the assaults near Bastogne, German troops captured a group of American soldiers. They expected to find them in the same miserable condition, half frozen, struggling to survive. But when they searched their prisoners, what they found left them speechless. The Americans wore thick, layered jackets lined with wool and fur. Their gloves were waterproof, their boots insulated with special inner layers. Many even carried spare socks sealed in wax paper to keep them dry. Some had small heating pads, chemical packs that generated warmth when activated. To the Germans, this seemed like magic. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks. Die Amerikaner haben Zauberstiefel, some whispered. The Americans have magic boots. A captured U.S. overcoat was passed around like treasure. German officers inspected it, touching the fabric again and again, unable to believe how light yet warm it was. They noticed the small details: adjustable straps, wine-proof collars, zippers that actually worked, and boots made of rubber and leather combinations that kept out moisture. One German sergeant later wrote in his diary, "When I saw their uniforms, I realized this was not the same kind of war anymore. They looked ready for the North Pole. We looked like beggars." That winter, many German soldiers began scavenging American corpses and abandoned camps, not for food or weapons, but for clothing. They stole boots, gloves, and coats whenever they could. Some even risked being shot by their own officers for wearing enemy gear. But survival was more important than uniform rules. In one chilling incident near the town of Houffalize, a German patrol found an abandoned American truck stuck in the snow. Inside it were boxes filled with winter supplies: sleeping bags, thermal socks, jackets, and waterproof covers. For the freezing soldiers, it was like discovering a gold mine. They tore open the boxes desperately, throwing on whatever they could. For the first time in weeks, they felt warmth again. But their relief didn't last long. The next morning, Allied planes returned to the skies, and the same soldiers who had stolen those warm clothes were now being hunted from above. The snow that had hidden them now became their trap. The white fields reflected the light, and German movements were easily spotted. Warmth had come at a price. Back on the American side, the difference was striking. U.S. soldiers weren't comfortable, but they were prepared. Their army had studied winter warfare after seeing what happened to the Germans in Russia. Every soldier had been issued layered clothing, waterproof gear, and even special shoe packs designed to prevent frostbite. Supply trucks delivered warm meals and coffee regularly. While the German troops shivered and starved, the Americans were eating canned stew and smoking cigarettes. The contrast was so great that even captured American letters home became a shock. One German officer found a letter from a U.S. soldier to his wife, describing how he'd just received a new pair of boots and was warm as toast in the middle of the Ardennes. The officer couldn't believe it. His own men had been cutting up blankets to wrap around their feet. German propaganda officers tried to hide this truth. They told their soldiers that the Americans were weak and spoiled, that they couldn't handle real hardship. But those on the front lines knew better. They had seen the enemy's boots, their coats, their gloves, and they envied them. For many Germans, that winter was the moment they realized the war was lost. It wasn't just about tanks and bullets anymore. It was about logistics, supply, and preparation. The Americans fought with comfort and abundance. The Germans fought with desperation and frostbite. In the forests of the Ardennes, some soldiers even began to pray, not for victory, but simply for warmth. One young private named Otto wrote in his notebook, "The snow is my enemy now. I dream of an American coat." As the days went on, the once confident German offensive began to slow. Engines froze, vehicles refused to start, and soldiers couldn't move their fingers to reload their rifles. Their morale sank as they saw Americans walking confidently through the snow, laughing, their faces covered but their spirits strong. For the Germans, every breath hurt. Every night felt like dying slowly, and yet the war demanded they keep fighting. They were trapped between Hitler's impossible orders and nature's unforgiving wrath. By the end of December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had turned into a struggle for survival, and the German soldiers who once mocked the Americans now looked at them with a strange mixture of fear, respect, and envy. They weren't just fighting another army. They were fighting a modern war machine equipped for every season, every condition. But this was only the beginning. Because soon, as the Germans continued to retreat deeper into the frozen woods, they would make another shocking discovery, one that would finally crush their hope completely. The snow kept falling. The white forests of Belgium had turned silent, broken only by the distant rumble of artillery and the desperate shouts of soldiers trying to stay alive. The German offensive that began with thunder was now crawling to a halt. Tanks were stuck in ice, fuel trucks couldn't reach the front, and men were collapsing from cold more than from bullets. But one thing kept the soldiers moving: the rumor. The rumor of an American supply depot hidden somewhere near Bastogne. They had heard stories from scouts, stories of entire warehouses filled with food, ammunition, blankets, and those mysterious winter uniforms that kept the Americans so warm. For the half-frozen German troops, it sounded like salvation. A small German unit under Lieutenant Franz Weber was ordered to investigate. They marched through waist-deep snow, their breath turning to frost with every word. Many had wrapped rags around their faces to stop the wind from cutting their skin. Their boots were stiff with ice, and every step felt like dragging stones. After hours of struggling through the forest, they reached a clearing, and there it was. An American supply camp, hastily abandoned after an air raid. Wooden crates were stacked in long rows, some half buried in snow. The German soldiers couldn't believe their eyes. The area looked more like a marketplace than a battlefield. They approached cautiously, rifles ready. But there were no Americans left, only the eerie silence of the frozen wilderness. Weber ordered 2 men to check the tents, while others began breaking open the crates. The first box they opened was filled with boots, brand new, wrapped in wax paper, lined with fur inside. One soldier held a pair in disbelief, rubbing his hands over the soft leather. Another crate contained thick jackets with fur collars, waterproof gloves, and scarves. The men stared at them as if they'd found treasure. Within minutes, discipline broke down. Soldiers tore off their own uniforms and began changing right there in the snow. They laughed, shouted, and for the first time in weeks felt alive again. Lieutenant Weber didn't stop them. He took a pair of boots for himself, slipped them on, and felt the warmth spread instantly through his feet. "Now I understand," he muttered. "Now I understand why they keep coming." But it wasn't just clothing they found. Inside another tent, they discovered boxes labeled Rations Type C. Inside were tins of meat, biscuits, chocolate bars, and instant coffee. The Germans sat in a circle and began eating like starving wolves. One of them, Private Klaus, took a sip of the powdered coffee mixed with melted snow and whispered, "It tastes like home." For a moment, the war disappeared. They forgot the cold, the hunger, the fear. They were just men trying to survive, but their joy didn't last long. As they searched deeper into the camp, they found something even more shocking: a small wooden structure filled with heating equipment. Portable stoves, chemical warmers, and neatly packed sleeping bags. The Americans had been living in luxury compared to them. Some of the German soldiers couldn't stop laughing. "They brought their homes to the battlefield," one said, shaking his head. But Lieutenant Weber wasn't laughing. He stood there staring at the abundance around him and what it meant. "This," he said quietly, "is why we will lose." He knew the truth now. The Americans had more supplies in one camp than his entire battalion had seen in months. Their factories were still running, their transport lines were endless, and their soldiers were fighting warm and well-fed. The German war machine, on the other hand, was collapsing from within, starved, frozen, and exhausted. The men filled their packs with whatever they could carry. Boots, gloves, canned food, even socks. Some dragged boxes onto sleds they had built from broken crates. They thought they could carry their salvation back to the front lines, but the snow was deep and they were weak. Progress was slow. And then in the distance, they heard a sound that froze their blood. The rumble of engines, American jeeps. Weber ordered his men to hide. They crouched behind the crates as headlights cut through the trees. A small U.S. patrol had returned to check the site. The Germans could see the Americans clearly now, moving easily, their jackets thick, their faces covered with scarves, their boots leaving clean prints in the snow. They looked strong, calm, confident, the exact opposite of the men hiding in the shadows. Weber whispered, "No shooting. Stay silent." But one of the younger soldiers, trembling from fear, accidentally dropped a metal can. The clatter echoed through the camp. The Americans froze. A second later, flares shot into the sky. The night turned bright white and gunfire erupted. The Germans scattered, diving into the forest. Bullets whistled past as they ran, stumbling through snow that swallowed their legs. Some fell, others never got up again. Weber's heart pounded as he dragged one of his wounded men behind a fallen tree. He could hear American voices shouting in the distance. By dawn, only a handful of them had survived and escaped. They had lost most of their loot, leaving the boxes behind in the snow. The few who made it back were half dead from exhaustion, but they carried with them something even heavier than stolen supplies. They carried the knowledge that Germany could no longer win. In the following days, German officers interrogated Weber about what he had seen. He told them everything, about the jackets, the boots, the food, and the supplies. His superior didn't believe it at first. "No army can afford such waste," the colonel said. Weber simply replied, "Theirs can." Word spread quickly among the troops. Men began to whisper about the American supply depots, about how the enemy lived like kings while they froze in their trenches. It was more than envy. It was the realization of a terrible truth. The war was no longer about courage or tactics. It was about who had the most fuel, the best factories, the strongest supply chains. As the snow thickened, more and more German soldiers began scavenging for American gear. Some were caught and punished for stealing from the enemy. Others simply disappeared into the woods, hoping to survive the winter on their own. By late December, when the German offensive had completely stalled, thousands of soldiers were wearing mixed uniforms, German helmets and American boots, German coats patched with American fabric. The front lines had become a strange sight, where the two sides looked more alike than anyone could imagine. The winter of 1944 didn't just freeze the German army, it exposed its weakness. And the men who had once laughed at the Americans now envied them deeply. For Lieutenant Weber, it became clear that the war was over long before Berlin fell. The moment he touched that American jacket and felt its warmth, he knew the truth. The Germans were fighting not just against an enemy, but against time, technology, and the unstoppable force of American industry. The forest had gone quiet again. The echoes of gunfire faded, leaving behind only the sound of wind dragging through the trees. Lieutenant Franz Weber and his few surviving men trudged through the snow, their faces pale and hollow, their spirits drained. Each step was a reminder of what they had lost, not just supplies, but hope. For the first time since the war began, Weber truly felt it. Germany was dying. Not with a bang, but with a slow, freezing silence. They found an old barn near the outskirts of a village and decided to take shelter for the night. Inside, the men sat huddled around a small fire made from broken furniture. Some wore mismatched uniforms now, German tunics, American gloves, boots of different sizes. The once proud Wehrmacht looked like a band of beggars trying to survive the wrath of winter. Weber stared into the fire, lost in thought. He remembered the supply depot, The warmth of those jackets, the taste of American food, the luxury hidden behind enemy lines. The image haunted him. The Americans were not only better equipped, they were prepared for everything. And he realized something frightening. The Germans had never really been prepared for anything. Outside, the wind screamed through the cracks in the barn walls. One soldier muttered, "Sir, how can they have so much? We fought them for years and they keep getting stronger." Weber didn't answer immediately. He knew the truth but didn't want to speak it aloud. Finally, he said, "Because they fight with factories, not just soldiers." It was a simple sentence, but it struck deep. Back in Germany, cities were in ruins. Bombs had destroyed factories, railroads, and power stations. Supply lines were collapsing, and fuel had become a treasure. Soldiers were told to save bullets, to retreat only when ordered, to fight even when they had nothing left. Meanwhile, across the ocean, America was producing everything in overwhelming numbers: tanks, trucks, planes, uniforms, and rations. Ships carried them across the Atlantic like a never-ending tide. The difference was no longer in bravery or tactics, it was in production. Weber's men fell asleep one by one, their breath freezing in the cold air. He stayed awake thinking. The war had turned into something mechanical, something impossible to win through courage alone. The next morning, they were ordered to regroup with a larger force near the town of St. Vith. As they marched, they passed through abandoned German positions. Everywhere they saw the same thing: soldiers wrapped in rags, cooking snow for water, trying to keep their rifles from freezing. At one outpost, Weber saw a man sitting motionless beside a dead fire. His boots were gone. Someone had stolen them in the night. The soldier's feet were bare, black with frostbite. He had died silently, probably in his sleep. Weber turned away. He couldn't bear it. By the time they reached St. Vith, the situation was worse than ever. American artillery had turned the town into rubble. Smoke rose from every building. The once strong German lines had shattered into fragments. Officers shouted orders that no one could follow. Radios didn't work. Trucks were abandoned, out of fuel. Weber went to report to a major stationed in a half-destroyed schoolhouse. Inside, the air smelled of oil and desperation. The major sat behind a table covered with maps, his hands shaking from the cold. "Lieutenant Weber," he said weakly, "did you find the American supply base?" "Yes, sir," Weber replied. "It was beyond anything we imagined. Food, clothing, heating, everything. They live like kings while we—" He stopped himself. The major sighed. "We all know it now. Even the Führer refuses to see it. But we know they have endless resources. We have courage, and courage freezes in the snow." Outside, the thunder of artillery grew louder. The Americans were advancing again. That night, Weber and his men were ordered to hold a small crossroads leading into the forest. It was a hopeless position, but they obeyed. They dug shallow trenches in the snow and waited. The temperature dropped even lower. The sky turned black, and the stars shone like shards of ice. Hours passed. Then in the distance they heard it, the low hum of engines. Dozens of them. Trucks, tanks, and armored vehicles moving steadily through the snow. The Americans were coming. Weber lifted his binoculars. What he saw through the glass made his heart sink. The U.S. convoy moved like a well-oiled machine. Trucks loaded with fuel, half-tracks carrying troops in clean, warm uniforms, headlights covered but glowing faintly. Even in the freezing night they moved smoothly, efficiently, without panic. Behind them came the support vehicles, mobile kitchens, repair trucks, and even ambulances. It wasn't just an army. It was an entire moving city. Weber whispered to himself, "We are fighting giants." When the first shells hit, the ground shook. The German line fired back, but it was hopeless. The Americans had artillery, tanks, and ammunition to spare. Weber's men ran out of shells in minutes, their rifles jammed from the cold. Some couldn't even pull the triggers with their frozen fingers. One of his soldiers, Klaus, the same man who had once drunk American coffee, shouted over the noise, "Sir, we can't hold them." Weber knew he was right. The Americans were pushing forward like an unstoppable tide, their engines roaring through the snowstorm. The Germans fell back, retreating into the forest. By dawn, the crossroads was lost. The ground was littered with broken helmets, rifles, and bodies, half buried in snow. Weber and the survivors hid among the trees, exhausted and numb. As the sun rose, they watched the American troops advance, setting up new positions with mechanical precision. Engineers built bridges, medics treated the wounded, and supply trucks arrived one after another. It was like watching a living organism, organized, endless, efficient. Weber couldn't look away. He turned to his men and said softly, "This is the difference. They plan for every storm, every step. We only react." No one answered. They were too tired to speak. That day, for the first time, Weber didn't think of victory or honor. He thought of survival. He looked at his frost-bitten hands, wrapped in stolen American gloves, and whispered, "Maybe the war ended the day we ran out of warmth." The snow continued to fall, covering everything, the dead, the living, the broken. The German dream of one last triumph was buried beneath it, frozen forever in the winter of 1944. But what came next would be even more devastating, because soon the Germans would discover the full scale of the American war machine, and what they found in those massive Allied depots would leave them speechless. The snow-covered forests of Belgium were no longer battlefields, they were graveyards. Thousands of German soldiers lay frozen in their trenches, their rifles buried under ice. The grand offensive that had begun with such confidence was now collapsing into chaos. And yet, scattered units still moved through the woods, clinging to hope, searching for shelter, food, or a miracle. Lieutenant Franz Weber and his few remaining men had survived another night. Their faces were pale, lips cracked from the cold. The American gloves and boots they had stolen were the only reason they were still alive. But the rest of their supplies were gone, lost during the retreat. Hunger was now their second enemy, the kind that eats you from the inside. Early one morning, as the grey light of dawn broke through the trees, they saw smoke rising from the valley below. It wasn't the thick black smoke of battle. It was steady, calm, and organized. Through his binoculars, Weber saw something that made him stop breathing for a moment. It was a massive Allied base. Trucks moved in long lines, soldiers unloaded crates, and tents stretched as far as he could see. Dozens of vehicles, all moving in perfect coordination. And at the center stood large warehouses built from wooden frames, their doors wide open. Inside, and mountains of supplies. Weber lowered the binoculars slowly. His men gathered around him. "Is it them?" one asked. "Yes," he said quietly. "It's the Americans. Their main supply hub." The men stared down in disbelief. To them, it didn't look like war. It looked like a factory that had never stopped working. The sound of engines, cranes, and shouted orders filled the air. It was life in motion, while the German army was dying in silence. One of the soldiers, Otto, whispered, "Sir, if we could take even a few boxes." Weber shook his head. "No, we're too few. That's not a camp, it's a city." But curiosity was stronger than fear. As night fell, Weber decided to move closer. They crept through the trees, their breath turning to fog in the cold air. From a ridge above the camp, they could see everything clearly. American soldiers worked in shifts, some unloading trucks, others repairing engines under bright electric lamps. Weber had never seen such organization. Every crate was labeled, every vehicle had a number. It wasn't chaos, it was order, precision, and power. They found an old barn nearby and hid there for the night. From inside, they could hear the hum of generators and the faint sound of laughter. Laughter, something Weber hadn't heard in months. His men stared through the cracks in the wood. They saw Americans drinking coffee from tin mugs, cooking over stoves, talking freely. There was music coming from a small radio, cheerful American tunes that sounded unreal in that frozen land. Otto muttered, "They're living like it's peacetime." Weber didn't answer. He just watched. Every soldier in that camp had thick coats, waterproof boots, and warm gloves. Their faces were clean, their gear polished. It was as if the cold couldn't touch them. Then came the moment that broke them completely. An American truck arrived carrying what looked like giant metal containers. The men opened them. Inside were portable showers, steam rising into the cold air. The German soldiers in the barn couldn't believe what they were seeing. Hot water in the middle of a battlefield. Klaus, the youngest among them, whispered, "They even bathe in war." The next morning, Weber decided to take a risk. He sent 2 men closer to gather information, and maybe food. They waited until a supply convoy moved out, leaving part of the depot lightly guarded. Then, under cover of snow, the 2 Germans slipped through the trees. Hours passed before they returned, breathless, eyes wide with shock. "Sir," one said, "you won't believe it. The warehouses are filled with everything. Rows of winter clothes, boots, medicine, canned food, even chocolate and cigarettes. There's fuel stacked like mountains. They have more than we ever had at the start of the war." Weber listened silently. Deep down, he had already known it, but hearing it confirmed broke something inside him. He looked out again at the camp below. American supply trucks kept arriving, their tires clean, their engines warm. None of them seemed to stop. It was endless, and then he understood the real reason why Germany was losing, not because of bravery, not even strategy, but because of industry. The Americans had turned war into a science, powered by steel, oil, and organization. That night, Weber wrote in his small notebook, "The Americans fight differently. They don't fight the cold, they outsmart it. They don't fear hunger. They feed it with factories. We were soldiers. They are a machine." As he wrote, the ground trembled with the sound of Allied trucks rolling by. His men tried to sleep, but the noise of progress was everywhere. At dawn, they were awakened by the sound of airplanes. Dozens of them. Allied bombers flew overhead, heading east. Weber's men rushed outside and looked up at the sky, filled with black dots moving in formation. One of them said quietly, "Even the sky belongs to them now." When the sun rose, Weber made his decision. "We can't fight them anymore," he told his men. "Not like this. We'll move west, find civilians, and surrender." No one protested. The war was over in their hearts. They began walking through the snow, leaving the sound of the American depot behind. But before leaving, Weber turned for one last look. The camp below was alive. Trucks moving, cranes lifting, soldiers working together. It was the image of everything Germany had once dreamed of becoming, but had failed to be. As they disappeared into the forest, the wind carried faint echoes of American voices and laughter. For Weber, that sound was the final proof. The war had already been decided long before this winter. Germany had entered the war with pride, discipline, and dreams of dominance. But America had entered it with power, organization, and an endless supply line that no storm, no hunger, no cold could stop. That winter didn't just freeze the German army, it froze their illusions forever. Weber and his men kept walking until the horizon disappeared in white. Behind them, the war machine rolled on, unstoppable, untouchable, and in that endless snow, Weber finally whispered to himself, "They didn't just win the Battle of the Bulge, they won the battle of survival." The days dragged on as the German soldiers, shivering and half-starved, marched through the icy wastelands of the Ardennes. Their boots, cracked from the cold, barely held together with cloth and wire. Frost had turned their breath into clouds of despair. The dream of victory had long vanished. Now the only battle left was survival. Yet amid this hopelessness, the stories of American winter gear still haunted their minds. They had seen captured Americans walking with steady steps, smiling even in the storm. Their coats thick, boots insulated, gloves warm. To the Germans, it was as if the enemy had turned the cold itself into a weapon. In a forest near Bastogne, one German platoon stumbled upon a wrecked American jeep buried halfway in snow. The vehicle's doors were frozen shut, but inside the soldiers found a treasure that felt almost unreal. American winter coats packed neatly in crates. The fabric was unlike anything they had ever seen, thick, layered, yet light enough to move easily. One soldier lifted a jacket close to his face, feeling its softness, whispering, "They even fight with comfort." Another found wool-lined gloves and slipped them on, sighing as warmth returned to his numb fingers. For a brief moment, they forgot the war. The jeep became their salvation, a gift from the enemy. But even that moment of comfort came at a price. As they huddled around the jeep, wrapping themselves in American gear, distant artillery thundered. The sky above them exploded in flashes of orange and white. The Americans were advancing again, relentless as ever. The German lieutenant shouted for everyone to move, but half the men were too weak to stand. The war was over for them, not by bullets, but by the freezing cold they could no longer fight. Those who could still walk carried their comrades through the snow, their bodies wrapped in a mix of German grey and American green. The two armies' colours blended in the storm, indistinguishable from each other, just men trying not to die. As dawn broke, the forest revealed a haunting sight. Dozens of German soldiers lay motionless, their rifles frozen to their hands. Nearby, a few survivors burned wooden crates for warmth, crates once filled with American gear. The irony was brutal. They were kept alive for now by the very supplies of the army they had sworn to destroy. Their officer, a man named Kurt, stared at the rising sun with hollow eyes. "If we had what they have," he murmured, "this war might have ended differently." But he knew it wouldn't have. The war wasn't just lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories, the supply lines, the endless production of a nation that never ran out. Behind enemy lines, American soldiers prepared coffee in metal cups, steam rising in the frosty air. They laughed, smoked, and shared chocolate, unaware that their captured gear had become lifelines for freezing German men only miles away. The contrast was brutal. One side fed, equipped, and strong. The other side starving, freezing, and broken. But war is full of such contradictions. The Americans didn't just win with weapons, they won with logistics, with the ability to fight comfortably in a place where comfort should have been impossible. When the fighting around Bastogne finally ended, and the German forces began their retreat, the American soldiers, walking through abandoned positions, found scenes that stayed with them for years. In trenches and ruined huts, they saw German bodies covered with American jackets, American boots, and American gloves. The sight was haunting. Men who had once been enemies now dressed like them in death. One American sergeant paused and whispered, "Even the enemy trusted our gear more than their command." He didn't mean it as arrogance, just as a truth of war that no one liked to admit. By early 1945, the snow began to melt. Rivers of ice turned to mud, and with them the last dreams of the German army sank into the ground. Hitler still demanded resistance, still screamed for victory from his bunker, but his soldiers in the field knew better. They had seen the strength of the enemy not just in numbers, but in the small things: boots that didn't break, coats that didn't freeze, and rations that didn't run out. The American army wasn't just fighting a war. It was proving what industrial power and preparation could do. The Germans had fought with bravery, but bravery alone doesn't warm your bones in a -20 battlefield. Months later, as prisoners of war, many German soldiers spoke about the American winter gear more than they spoke about the battles themselves. One officer said, "We thought we were fighting men. We were fighting a system, one that cared for every soldier." Another added, "When I first saw their boots, I knew we had already lost." Those words summed up the silent truth of the Winter War, the one not fought with guns, but with wool, leather, and planning. For the Americans, the Battle of the Bulge became a story of courage and endurance. For the Germans, it became a memory of cold and loss. The snow had been their greatest enemy, and the American gear had been their greatest envy. Decades later, historians would write about strategies, tanks and generals, but those who had been there remembered something simpler: the feeling of warmth that could mean life or death. And so, the winter of 1944 ended not with a grand victory parade, but with quiet understanding. The Germans had learned that war was not only about fighting hard, it was about being ready for every condition, every hardship. The American soldiers, with their layered coats and dry socks, had shown that preparation could be more powerful than pride. In the frozen forests of Europe, where thousands once froze under grey skies, remnants of that time still lie buried: rusted helmets, tattered coats, boots half swallowed by earth, silent witnesses of a war where technology met suffering, and where the warmth of one army became the envy of another. And for those few German soldiers who survived that winter, the memory of American winter gear never faded. Even years after the war, they would tell their children, the Americans fought differently. They fought warm. The cold had taken everything from them, but it had also taught them the most human lesson of all. In war, it isn't always the strongest who survive, but the best prepared,